Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar on how can companies minimize the risk of a data breach. During this session, I'll be focusing on the cybersecurity risks organizations are exposed to, the type of threats organizations should look out for, how these threats affect infrastructure and data, and also at the end of it, I'll also go into a couple of security tips on how to minimize the risk of a data breach and how to deal with threats. I know it sounds like a lot, but bear with me. But before we get started, maybe I should probably introduce myself. Liviu Arsene. I'm a global cybersecurity researcher for Bitdefender, and I've spent the better part of a decade in the security industry alone. My main focus currently is reporting on malware outbreaks and security incidents, while at the same time coordinating with technical and research departments. However, I've also been closely working and interfacing with cross-company development teams because my past role of a product manager involved basically understanding Bitdefender's entire technology stack. And well, I guess with that out of the way, let's take a really quick look at the agenda. So for the next 30 to 45 minutes, I'll be covering a couple of topics ranging from cybercrime to threats, data breaches, costs associated with data breaches, and of course, recommendations on how to prevent potential data breaches. Please remember that if you have questions, be sure to use the chat window, and I'll be sure to address them at the end of the session before signing off. Now, the reason why this webinar is entitled Sight Unseen is because the average time to identify a breach, pretty much across all industries, is somewhere around 200 days, while the average time to contain a breach across all industries is somewhere around 70 days. What this tells us is not only that threat actors have pretty much an ample window of opportunity when it comes to infiltrating and exfiltrating information once they're inside the infrastructure, but also that it does take pretty much a considerable amount of time for organizations to contain the breach. With about, if I'm not mistaken, about 75% of breaches being financially motivated, it actually makes sense that cybercrime is a trillion-dollar industry. And in the next slide, we'll see exactly just how much the cybercrime industry is actually worth. Also, an important topic that I'd like to touch is that threats have constantly evolved in both numbers and sophistication. And the fact that in fact, the malware development industry has even adopted an as-a-service model, which basically means malware developers operate as software outsourcing companies, if you will, offering their services to the highest bidder. So with malware employing advanced security evasion techniques, advanced obfuscation tactics, or encryption, pretty much sophisticated malware nowadays has become, if you will, a low-hanging fruit. Now, the perfect example of this is ransomware, which is one of the most financially profitable threats that has amassed huge profits in the billions of dollars for cyber criminals over the course of just a couple of years. Just so you know, we'll also take a closer look at this threat later on, and soon afterwards, we'll dive into some of the most recent and notorious data breaches, basically to learn how they occurred and what we can learn from those data breaches. Again, finally, we'll conclude with what are some of the costs that companies incur after a data breach, and of course, recommendations on how to both avoid data breaches and minimize the financial and reputational fallout of a data breach. Just as I mentioned in the previous slide, cybercrime is probably one of the most prolific industries, and it's worth remembering that global companies could incur up to $5.2 trillion in additional costs and lost revenue over the next 5 years due to cyber attacks. And this is something that comes from a recent study from Accenture. It's worth noting that in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, the figure used to be around $3 trillion. pretty much suggesting that the estimated cybercrime business has almost doubled in only a couple of years. Also, the global cybercrime economy generates over $1.5 trillion in profits acquired, laundered, spent, and even reinvested by cybercriminals. So whoever said that crime doesn't pay clearly was not talking about cybercrime. While the cybercrime-based economy has actually become a self-sustaining system comprised of an interconnected web of profit that pretty much blurs the lines between the legitimate and illegitimate, data breach costs for enterprises have increased by 6.4% on average year over year. So, consequently, the average total cost of a data breach has now been estimated at $3.86 million, while the average total cost in the United States is about $7.9 million and about $5.3 million in the Middle East. Now, it's worth remembering that automation plays a critical role in securing infrastructures. For example, the average cost of a data breach for organizations that fully deploy security automation is somewhere around $2.8 million. While for those without automation, the estimated cost is somewhere around $4.4 million. So automation clearly plays a critical role in reducing the cost of a data breach, but only when it can help organizations identify the most frequent security incidents and whether they are critical to their overall security posture. This will also actually help the organization understand how much time they can save security teams by offloading these tasks. Also, another interesting fact is that in about 48% of data breaches, which is almost half of data breaches, the root cause seems to be malicious or criminal attacks. So this means a data breach is much more likely to occur because of advanced malware rather than human error or system glitches, which is why I believe it's vital to break the attack kill chain as early on as possible. On the threats topic, there are quite a few that actually pose security risks for organizations, such as human error, BYOD, insider threats, and even ransomware. I'll actually focus on ransomware a bit more during the next couple of slides because studies have found, research has shown that it's responsible for about 70% of breach attempts, at least when it comes to the malicious code category. While ransomware is a type of threat that pretty much indiscriminately targets all verticals, about 70% of ransomware attacks target small businesses with an average ransom demand of about $100,000 and a median of about $10,000. So basically, it's far more appealing to target smaller businesses because they usually store increasing quantities of personally identifiable and sensitive information that pretty much is as critical as it gets. And they also have, sometimes at least, lax security practices. I remember reading that one of the highest ransom demands for one of these companies was around $8.5 million, or somewhere around 3,000 Bitcoin at the time, while the highest ransom paid was somewhere around $900,000, close to $1 million. Next, human error means that sensitive data meant for person one, inadvertently given to person two, is actually categorized as misdelivery, and it is a common type of error. Actually, I think more than 38% of unintentional actions that directly compromise security deal with misdelivery of data information, followed by disposing of sensitive data in an insecure manner, and actually the physical misplacement of assets. Some examples involve, let's say, prescription information or even contracts that contain personally identifiable information, which mistakenly end up to unintended recipients. Interestingly enough, insider threats account for over 57, close to 60% of data breaches. And the reason behind it is not financial, as one would expect, or as we've grown accustomed to from ransomware, but it's because of curiosity. For instance, let's take a look at hospitals. The admission of a family member, acquaintance, or well-known personality into a hospital can present a temptation for employees who have access to that patient's health record, but actually no direct role in providing any care or services to that patient. BYOD, bring your own device, is also considered a threat because sometimes access to records is granted to any device that's connected to the infrastructure, even if it's not managed by the IT or security teams. So this basically means that sometimes data is accessed and downloaded on devices that do not, for example, have encryption, do not adhere to any security policies, do not have any password protection that would otherwise prevent, say, someone who stole a tablet or phone from accessing information stored on that device. Also, something that I forgot to add to this diagram, there's another threat that's equally dangerous for organizations, which is adware. Well, adware is pretty much somewhat, if you will, in the gray area, as some security vendors consider it, malicious, while others don't. Adware affects organizations across all verticals. In fact, we've even uncovered two very powerful adware frameworks that even came with rootkit capabilities and the ability to fully control the victim systems. As a Chinlo was discovered, I believe, by Bitdefender Labs in 2018, and actually found to have been active since 2012. And just today, actually just a couple of hours ago, we published a new piece of research on something that we've named Skranos. Although the Skranos campaign has not reached the magnitude of the Chinlo, it is already infecting users all worldwide. But anyway, for more technical information on the capabilities of these two threats and how they operate, please feel free to check out labs.bitdefender.com and grab the white papers. Now, since we've talked about ransomware, the GandCrab ransomware family, which is currently the most prolific ransomware families, was actually discovered in early 2018. Now, because it's being distributed under a ransomware as a service model, it actually quickly became one of the most popular ransomware families amongst attackers after infecting hundreds of thousands of victims in a little over a year of activity. While there have been numerous versions available, they're pretty much all similar in behavior and only feature minor improvements, if you will, in respect to changing encryption ciphers to encrypt files faster, delivery mechanisms in order to dodge detection from security solutions, and even evasion techniques to make it difficult for security researchers to come up with ransomware decryption tools. For example, some ransomware variants were even packing the NSA Eternal Blue exploit to exploit unpatched SMB vulnerabilities, so just so they can spread even faster within unpatched infrastructures. Also, they abused the remote desktop protocol to dial into infrastructures and manually deploy ransomware. So this is basically one of the, if you will, is currently one of the top ransomware attack vectors, which accounts for over 85% of ransomware infections. Now the ransomware demand for GandCrab ranges between $600 and somewhere around $700,000, depending on the victim's profile and how critical the encrypted data is for the organization. So now you see why ransomware is actually so financially profitable and so prolific in terms of cybercriminal activities. One particularly interesting aspect of GANCrab is that it will not infect a Russian-based system. Well, in fact, it actually scans for regional settings and keyboard layouts to determine if the victim is Russian-based or Russian-speaking, and won't engage or deploy the encryption mechanism. Now, I've told you all this about GANCrab because working in close collaboration with Europol and other law enforcement institutions, we are now able to offer a new version of a decryption tool, a free version of a free decryption tool to counter all these versions of GANCrab. So basically, these new decryption tools that pretty much allow victims to regain access to their own data without paying a ransom to cybercriminals, which, by the way, is highly unrecommended because of so many things, one of which being you cannot trust cybercriminals because they are cybercriminals. There is no guarantee that they will honor their end of the bargain and actually send you the decryption key. The criminal mastermind might actually be behind bars, and he probably might not be able to send you the decryption key. The command and control server may actually be seized by authorities and placed under investigation. So again, if you pay the ransom, there is absolutely no possibility that you could ever receive the decryption key, and so on. Plus, even if you pay the ransom note, you will only be fueling other cybercriminal activities. So anyway, the point is the GANCrab decryption tool that we have developed in collaboration with Europol and other law enforcement agencies can decrypt GANCrab versions 1, 4, early versions of 5, and even some of the most prolific versions such as 5.04 and 5.1. Needless to say, the tool has been highly popular and it's been downloaded more than 400,000 times. It has helped more than 10,000 victims save somewhere around $5 million in decryption keys so far. Also, as a funny side note, while versions of 5.04 through 5.1 have created the most victims, GANCrab developers have started releasing new variants, particularly 5.2 at the time. So when we analyzed this new variant, we found a string saying something along the lines of Bitdefender sucks, of course, not in such a pleasant manner. But this means that while we're watching their activity, they're also keeping a close eye on us. In terms of recent data breaches that have made it into the media because of a large number of records that have been exposed, I assume we're all familiar with at least some of the companies in the slide. In 2018, a criminal hack took place on the British Airline website and app, affecting bookings made by credit cards and exposed user data belonging to about 380,000 users. Another hack involved T-Mobile, when an international group of hackers accessed their servers through an API and got a hold of personal data and passwords belonging to about 2 million of their users. TimeHop was also a victim in 2018 as hackers accessed the cloud computing account of the TimeHop website and got a hold of personal information, including names, email addresses, and phone numbers belonging to roughly 21 million of their subscribers. Facebook in 2018 was also in the spotlight when hackers made use of several vulnerabilities in Facebook's code and actually gained full access to users' data that included sensitive information such as user location, relationship status, devices used, recent searches, all of this pretty much affecting around 29 million Facebook users. Quora was also in the spotlight when a malicious third party gained access to their systems and retrieved account information on about 100 million user accounts, if I'm not mistaken, while the Marriott Starwood incident potentially exposed guest information, including phone numbers, email addresses, even passport numbers, credit card numbers, all of this belonging to about 5 million hotel guests. And all of this happened when hackers access the reservation database. Now, probably one of the biggest breaches, data breaches, involves the Indian government portal for storing information on its residents, as well as biometric information on them. For example, Aadhaar. This is when 1.1 billion users had their data exposed because of an insecure API that was used to check a customer's status and verify their identity. Now, these are only a handful of data breaches that occurred in 2018, but the fact they all happened because of unpatched vulnerabilities, insecure APIs, or even vulnerabilities in websites proves that it does not take hackers investing in millions of dollars worth of zero-day vulnerabilities, but simply they rely on the same bag of tricks, which is exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities, stealing and using credentials, and so on. Now, and just to help understand, and just to help with understanding why costs associated with mitigating data breaches are so high, you should look at post-data breach costs as an iceberg, if you will. You have basically above the surface costs, which usually involve technical investigation costs, customer protection costs, regulatory compliance costs, and even PR costs. While these are usually known and easily quantifiable cyber incidents costs, they don't necessarily tell the whole story, because there are beneath the surface costs, which usually involve insurance premium costs, operational disruptions, loss of intellectual property, brand devaluation, and even lost value of customer relationships. Also, indirect costs may involve the allocation of resources, such as employees' time and effort to notify victims and actually investigate the breach. These are the most difficult costs to estimate, and the time to identify and contain data breaches directly impacts costs. So naturally, the faster data breach can be identified and contained, the lower the costs. Now, besides everything I've mentioned so far, here are some recommendations or recommended actions that can help save time and money when preventing or dealing with a data breach. Now, one of the most important aspects is that compliance and security best practices always work hand in hand. Now, simply reaching for compliance does not mean that your infrastructure is secure, as well as going after best practices does not necessarily mean that you can skip compliance. Actually, it doesn't. These two, I mean, both of these augment each other's capabilities. Network security policies and access control policies should help spot anomalous network behavior and spot whether data is being exfiltrated or accessed by unsanctioned personnel. It can also be used as a very powerful post-mortem forensic investigation tool. Also, it's important to train personnel in order to respect internal procedures, and also teach them how to spot phishing and spear phishing emails. Actually, the spear phishing emails, I believe, are one of the biggest concerns to organizations, and it's probably one of the main attack vectors that attackers have successfully used for decades, either when performing simple malware infections that deliver ransomware, or when performing when deploying advanced persistent threats that involve compromising government infrastructures or political figures and so on. So basically, it's important to train employees to spot these spear phishing emails. So setting up constant warlike scenarios help employees both stay educated on potential security risks, while also improves their security skills. Now, deploying security patches and updates is also vital. As I've mentioned earlier, ransomware and pretty much all threats usually make use of known but unpatched vulnerabilities to either infiltrate or move laterally across the infrastructure. So basically, be sure to have a policy in place to test and roll out updates and patches without affecting or even destabilizing your infrastructure, pretty much in an effort to beef up security. Continuous threat monitoring and endpoint security can also be achieved by using, say, integrated endpoint security solution and even endpoint detection and response solutions that can offer complete visibility across the entire infrastructure on potential, when it comes to potential data breaches. Last but not least, having an incident response plan and constantly updating it after investigating security incidents is more than recommended. It actually represents an organized approach towards validating, addressing, and even managing the aftermath of a security breach or cyber attack. Now, also, the goal of an incident response plan is to handle the situation in a way that limits damage, costs, and ultimately reduces recovery time. So I guess if I am to leave you with just one thought to conclude this webinar as I'm approaching the 30-minute mark, I think it should be this. Minimizing the risk of a data breach involves basically two things. One, understanding the threat landscape and how threats have evolved in order to bypass traditional security solutions. And two, compliance best practices and security technologies that offer visibility across the entire infrastructure can help prevent, detect, and minimize the fallout of a potential data breach. And with that out of the way, let's see if we have any questions so far. Again, please feel free to use the chat window at your own discretions, and I'll be sure to answer them either during this webinar or maybe you can ask the same questions during a follow-up webinar that one of my Bitdefender colleagues will be hosting on April 18th. I believe it's entitled 5 Key Elements for an Effective Endpoint Security Strategy. So we've got our first question, which is creating data policy or flow standard data policies are two different things, or follow standard data policies are two different things. They don't necessarily have to be, but they can overlap. For example, there are standard data policies that you have to adhere. For example, if you're an European organization that deals with personal information from European users, you have to abide by both local law enforcement, local legislation based on the country you're based in terms of how you process and store that personal information, and you also have to abide by GDPR. But that does not mean that you cannot create your own data policies. For example, why just stop with regulations and law enforcement and legislation? For example, you can set up policies that revolve around setting up additional security layers, additional filters for who has access to that information. You can filter down as much as possible the information that you're collecting from users, just in order to make sure that in case of a data breach, that information, the information that's stolen, cannot be aggregated and used in some way to identify a particular individual, and so on and so forth. This pretty much means that in case of a data breach, you can pretty much certify that you have done everything and anything in your power to make sure that even if data has been stolen, breached, or otherwise compromised, it cannot be used to perform identity theft or any sort of fraudulent activities. So again, you don't necessarily have to just follow standard data policy. You can create your own data policies, and these can be complementary policies. Let's see. I'll mark this one of answer. So I'm going to give you guys just 1 extra minute. So if you have questions, please be sure to answer them. As a reminder, we've got another presentation from Bitdefender coming up on April 18th. One of my colleagues, he'll be addressing the topic, 5 key elements of an effective endpoint security strategy. And if you're interested to learn more about that, please be sure to dive into that as well. If there are no more questions, and they don't necessarily seem to be, I guess I'll sign off here. As a reminder, thank you. I'm Liviu Arsene. I'm a global cybersecurity researcher for Bitdefender, and thank you everyone for attending. See you next time.